Well, good Thursday evening to you. I believe we're running. I'm trying to learn from week to week how this thing starts, and I know that if you can't see us or hear us correctly, I will have a smart comment showing up on my phone any second now. So I'm trusting that this is going. But thank you for carving out a few minutes of your time this evening to join with us in a bit of a conversation. We know this is one-sided in the sense we're not hearing from you. We might try that one week. We'll see. We're still building our own confidence in doing it this way before we throw in new elements. But tonight we thought we would take a few minutes to talk about the topic of, as Christians, how do we fulfill our God-given responsibilities and stations in life? Now, before you maybe close your browser or push the power button on your TV, because that sounds maybe not very interesting to you, maybe you are asking, like, what in the world, why such a broad topic for a short live stream? And what does that have to do with our situations? So we want to talk about that. But for the next few minutes, we will ask the question, how are we as Christians to fulfill the responsibilities of our life stations? Chris will get us started with that, just so that we can talk through some of these things and bring it down to earth, take a big topic and bring it down to earth. So Chris, maybe you can walk us into explaining that. So like, of all the things we could talk about tonight, all the things that we're seeing in the news, all the things we're experiencing, all of the good, topics that we would have to open up scripture to, why are we choosing this one to talk about?
Yeah. This stay-at-home order has us in a very unique situation, obviously one that we've not experienced in our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. And many of our regular rhythms that we go through in our lives have seemingly been put on pause. They're regularly going, or if not paused, they've been drastically changed in some way so that we're not interacting in the same ways. Many of the different specific pieces have been cut out so that we're doing it differently or not at all. And this leaves many of us off the roads, working from home, away from running from store to store, or from picking up kids up from practice, or away from our appointments, away from work functions, school events, sporting events, social gatherings, the gym, etc., all these things. And of course, it's not true for everyone, but many of us find ourselves in a very different situation than normal. I've talked to a few that are almost as regular, still working. The Navy has a few people working just as crazy as they always were. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean like they're very busy and things continue on. But for several of us, our responsibilities have changed drastically during this social distancing. And the phenomenon has brought several things to light that we wouldn't otherwise notice in our busy lives and all the different things that are going on. And it's brought up a few things that I just kind of thought a few through that kind of catch our attention here. First, many people have had a lot of their external responsibilities, usually I mean by that is outside of their houses, outside of their normal type family unit. Those responsibilities have been either stopped or paused for a season, whether it's a straight furlough all the way, or again, a truncated schedule or an A-B schedule, but a lot of these things have been boiled down to something that's only essential, and there's been like kind of put of a pause. And this leaves us a little confused, and it seems like everything is just paused or stopped until everything else gets back to normal. We can all get back up to a normal pace. No work, no church services, no community group gatherings, no school, no Bible studies, no activities or friends over to your house. And it seems like everything is just suspended for a moment, and we aren't going to be, if I can say it this way, held responsible for all these different things during this time. It kind of is like, okay, man, you had these deadlines, but now we got this, so you don't have to quite worry about it as much. Kind of suspend things. Like I heard an advertisement for Hulu that said something like, go ahead, you've got the green light, you've got Hulu, stream away to your heart's content. That idea that, hey, you're not doing anything, you might as well just stream all this content and have a great time. You don't have any responsibilities anymore. You got nothing better to do, so you might as well use our service to enjoy yourselves and keep yourself, since you don't have any more responsibilities to fulfill.
Yeah.
And I know this is not everyone's struggle, but it certainly creates a tendency for us to kind of let the rest of our responsibilities go for a time. In a way, sometimes I don't know that we've given good thought to whether or not we should be letting them go. We're just putting all of it on pause, and we kind of all step away from everything for a moment. Another thing that I've been thinking about that makes this so different are the different reactions that people have to this. Some, when this happens, they are like, yay, free time, to do whatever I want to. This is great. I can just go enjoy myself. And then you've got the other that instead of yay, it's like, I can't get my work done. I'm not going to meet any deadlines. I'm going to be behind on all my goals. I'm not getting stuff done, and I am feeling anxious. I'm overwhelmed by this. There are other reactions to be sure, but our situation points and pushes us all into kind of uncharted territories that we're not used to, and it kind of reveals some of our desires. And the last thing that I noticed in this time is that so many who normally work outside of the home and do life outside of the home and educate outside of the home, they are now all confined. Many, not all, but many are confined to the four walls of a house. And many of us are normally so busy with long hours at work, with extra responsibilities, away from the home with kids' lessons and practices, school events, social requirements, that we normally spend long amounts of time outside of the home, away from those who live in our house together with us or don't. And for some of us, that means that at this time, they go home to a completely empty house and they're constantly alone. That's a very different schedule from what they're used to. They're used to going to the gym. They're used to working for many hours in the day. They're used to connecting a Bible study. And then they finish up the day kind of alone at the house, something like that. And for those that are either single or perhaps their husband or wife are away on deployment, it leaves them in a very different position that they've not been in before. And then for other ones that do have a spouse that lives there at home with them or children who are in the home, now you've got a full day where you normally had it broken up by being away from them for so much time, and now you're together constantly. And we think that's a good idea sometimes, but then we realize at certain points that we're selfish people and that we're not used to these things. And sometimes I hate to say this, but I think it's true sometimes that work can be a distraction or kind of a break from having to work through all the things that are so difficult in a family with other people, with your spouse or with your children. In all those situations, there are no distractions. There's no breaks now from what's going on now. Always in the house at the same time. This can be a lot for a regular basis to be with one another. And then again, this may not be all of us, but the reality is that I don't think that many of us are talking about how this is really affecting us. We kind of can numb it by having the fun ideas and seeing the memes about quarantine and all these things, but really it is kind of pointing that there's some issues underlying this that we really need to deal with. And all I have to say, many of these things have caused us, we've talked about this, to work through our roles and responsibilities at a time like this, and then broader at a time, in any time, how it's supposed to look and what we're supposed to do. But Christians, as we look at this, we know we have a distinct stewardship in whatever time we're living through. So we thought that it would be appropriate, as friends and pastors, to kind of have a short conversation to help us to consider how a Christian ought to approach our roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, yeah, you're hitting on, hey, this is a big topic, but this is how it's impacting us right now. And I think that's definitely true. As I interact with people, as we just pull up Zoom with community groups and stuff, there are ways in which we know it's impacting different ones in the ways that you describe. And there can be aspects of fun to it sometimes, like a snow day type fun, but I think we're through that now in pretty much every way. So we kind of start thinking.
It's just like the deep Alaskan snow days that last for the whole winter.
Yeah, this is the freeze, the full winter freeze. We're experiencing those types of things in our own home in different ways too. So it's certainly the case. So, all right, so let's get to it then in some of these outworkings then. So as you've been thinking about this, we've talked a little bit about this week too. What are your thoughts on then how we as Christians identify and think about these life stations? What do we mean by life stations? Maybe these roles and responsibilities, and then play out how we think about those as Christians.
Yeah. So I'm going to go as much as I can thoroughly practical. I think this is I think hopefully this is an easy way to approach it. There's three things that I think we can kind of look at, identify, and help us understand how to move forward. Really 3 points to help us make it careful, help us move carefully into a biblical direction for handling these different roles and responsibilities. The first thing is to identify our roles. You and I have different families. We have different family situations. We live in different neighborhoods. You and I, everyone that's watching is different than me. You have different children perhaps, or different life circumstances, or different work experiences. And so I think the first thing is just to take some time and identify all those roles and responsibilities that you have that are required of you in each different part of your life. So it's thinking through things like the bigger realms, like your personal life, family, church, home, friends, school, work, of course, neighborhood, and even country. Like as big picture, like, okay, how do I relate and what are my responsibilities in those areas? And again, there may be some people have a lot of responsibilities in those areas and other ones that people don't. That's okay. But for example, personally, you need to think about your own spiritual health, but you also need to consider your own spiritual your physical fitness or your physical health. For your family, you need to consider your responsibilities. Perhaps you're a son or daughter of parents still, or maybe you're a brother or sister of siblings. You can be a husband or a wife in a relationship and those responsibilities. Or perhaps you're a son or daughter also that's still young in your own parents' home. This is for all of us. Or perhaps you're a parent doing the work of actually being a mom or a dad. In church, we consider this, or I want to skip this in family, like just being a spouse as well is a huge role that we've got to think through here. In church, what does it mean to be a child of God? Actually be that, like a Christian. What does it mean in the responsibilities we have as church members to one another? How about servants of the corporate body, different parts of serving the church body, anywhere from like being a coffee barista to a children's teacher and what that looks like. And the list goes on and on. I mean, you could talk about the responsibilities of being a renter or a home owner, what kind of things that you have to do to keep up and keep going. You have to steward your finances in some way. You have been given this, or you've worked for this in the sense, of course, it's been given to you by God, but what will you do with that money? So you're a financial steward as well. Perhaps you're a student in school, or a student of a craft or a trade or at work, still on the job. What's your responsibilities in all those things to learn? And you may live in a neighborhood, maybe a big one, and maybe even a small neighborhood, but whether we like it or not, we are neighbors as well. So we need to think about all those different things and kind of at least get a count or a list of the things that we have some sort of responsibility in.
Yeah, and as you get into the weeds a little bit with that, there's a lot of things that come up. So yeah, it certainly includes those high level ones like you mentioned, but some of those ones that we don't often think about as we dig into the weeds. And so in a way, I mean, you just rattled off a whole bunch of stuff there when you think about it, and you're like, I thought I was remembering all the plates that I had spinning, and you just reminded me of half a dozen more. So there are more people reaching for their remotes right now to turn us off. Like, this is not helpful. This is not good news. So when we take all of those things, we're not going to run to the scripture and just say like, okay, this is my user's manual for such and such a station or another such and such a station. We're not going to run to it to try and find like the proof text, right, for every individual one. Though there are going to be some things, there are going to be some truths that pop out, I'm sure, and you might even speak to some of them. But how do we go to the scriptures to understand what it's saying about those things? And does it even say something? Does it have anything to give us for half of those things that you just mentioned?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to back up a little bit, and I'm assuming that the answer to that question is yes, that there is something the scriptures say to it. So I rattled off all those different things. And I think the caution here is for us to be careful is like, this isn't supposed to be a productivity session where we're all like, okay, I need to organize my life, get it all done so that I know how to better be productive. That's not what we're trying to do. And you'll see what I mean once we get to our third point. But it's important that we kind of talk these things through to get a realistic understanding of where we're at and look at it. So to get to your question, though, I think one of the first things we ought to do in these different areas, we go to the scriptures and see if there are specific instructions for us. For instance, if you're a father, you know that there are certain instructions that the Bible gives very simply about how to take care of children, how to make sure you provide for your household, how to not provoke them to wrath, how to instruct them. Or perhaps, or a different one, like I'm also a beekeeper, or maybe you're a coffee barista. When we go to the scriptures for those things, we don't see specific, specific instruction. We're not trying to make it fit and make like, well, this thing back here is what it means for me to do this. So that's my proof text to go to. No, not necessarily. There's certainly broad, sweeping understanding of how we ought to act. But I'm talking about, first of all, we should look at the scriptures and see if in these responsibilities, if we do have direct instruction. Yeah. But I think there's a second one, is that there is, not only do we look to the scriptures, which is number one, but the second thing that we ought to do, as the Bible tells us, therefore, is to work with one another and submit to the powers that be, and ask ourselves, what do our earthly authorities, and I don't mean like just government, but perhaps our bosses, or perhaps the different customs that we work with people, what do they expect of us in those roles and responsibilities? So like the first one is, what does the Bible specifically instruct? Some things are very clear, other things there's not a lot. But I think it's helpful for us to also look at what our earthly authorities require of us in our areas of responsibility. Again, like our bosses, government, organizations, etc. And we need to know what is needed from us so that we can properly serve the people in our responsibility, whether it's to serve people above us to do other things, or people below us in the sense that we have authority over as well. And for many of you, you have a job description, like expectations at work. I remember, I had so many SOPs that I was responsible for to make sure I understood that that's true. And expectations and really what your boss needs of you, we need to be able to understand, and then also, in a sense, be able to perform to the job that we're called to do and responsibilities that we have. Some of those are more clear, and some of them aren't quite as clear. So we need to think those through and understand that as much as we possibly can.
Good. What else? So, thinking those things through high level, first and foremost, looking at it that way, as you said, like there are some aspects that are right there in scriptures. Other times it's more overarching. Yeah. But then also just considering the way God's designed the world to work too. Yeah. That having those authorities and having a government and those things are not wrong. It's not an aspect of sin, right? Right. But those are part of God's design.
Right. It is exactly right. Those things are really, in a sense, God's grace and common grace to use even sinful men to set up good governments that would allow for liberty and people to function and serve one another properly. So I think that's certainly important for us to recognize and make sure that I don't think it's a bad thing to make sure we understand how to best serve those that are around us, fellow image bearers, and really go back to the law, love God and love our neighbor as well. So the first thing, again, to kind of move on then, the first thing is to identify these roles and responsibilities. Then the second thing is I would encourage us to be honest with ourselves, to get honest and see how we're doing. As we create somewhat of a list and understand what's going on, how are we fulfilling those responsibilities? Are we fulfilling them? Does it seem as though we are doing well, poorly? We could do better, and kind of in a sense give ourselves an honest grade to see how we're doing in each of those responsibilities that we are responsible to steward for others, for ourselves, and for God. So I think that's really important for us to think through what's the realistic view of what's going on around me. Am I actually doing the things that I am supposed to be doing? Or like you said, do we forget at least half of these responsibilities and never kind of get into them until something bad happens, and then we take control to be able to do our best to respond? I think it's helpful for us to take an idea of it right now, get an account, and then move forward once we have an understanding of it and can honestly look and see if we're wasting our time, if we're not doing anything at all, if we are not being good stewards of those things, or maybe we are. Again, it's a helpful, realistic view to understand how to move forward.
Yeah. So you're kind of saying, right in the thick of it, we've been kind of in this stay-at-home setting for a month or so now. There's a way to evaluate how we've been handling those things, even in the changes of them, how we've been handling them this past month. You're like, oh, maybe there's some things we have just kind of let fall by the wayside. We've been ignoring that. But then also there's maybe a good in the mix here, because in the busyness of normal life, there's a way in which we can maybe have a tendency to push some of those stations of life to the back burner and not think about them. And have the excuse of the busyness, the things that are on the front burner. We're doing those, so let's not think about those. Don't bring those up because I'm doing good work right here. We have the opportunity to have some time to honestly evaluate, because when that busyness is stripped from us in certain ways, the other things are sitting there waiting for us to evaluate, and they're probably showing themselves in different ways to be wanting in certain ways too. So this can be a good time to reflect on these things and evaluate in different ways. Yeah.
In a sense, you've said this before, and is that don't waste your quarantine. Don't waste your stay-at-home directive.
Yeah, that's right. I tried to make sure when I wrote that there's a timestamp somewhere so we can show that we said that before the bloggers and everything. Yeah. All right. So identifying them and then working through being honest with those aspects. You said there were 3 things you were thinking of. So what would the third be?
So identify roles and responsibilities. Be honest about them so that we have a real idea of how we're doing. But the third point really is what is the reason this whole is a Christian conversation. Up to this point, it could be, was it David Black who does David Allen, who does getting things done. It could just be one of his sessions or something, and then we could just rattle off all the things to help us get those things done better in our responsibilities, and make sure that you add this to your day timer, and make sure you clear your email. All those things are good. What I want, and the third one though, for us as Christians especially to consider is remember our ultimate identity, and then we need to live according to that. Again, that's what makes this a Christian conversation. Sure, we're trying our best to take all those things and do better at the responsibilities, or maybe trim the responsibilities that we can. We should let go if they're not good responsibilities for us to fulfill well. That's good. What I'm saying, though, is let's go to the scriptures and realize that we have an identity that speaks into each and every one of these responsibilities in a way that someone who does not trust Christ or love him, they don't have those things. And so I want us to remember our ultimate identity and then live accordingly. How then, so that now we go back to the original question, how does a Christian having, identity of Jesus Christ, having our identity, our gospel identity in him, how does that, being a Christian, affect how we fulfill our roles and responsibilities? We can just talk about doing things, getting them done. But there have been many times when Kristen has told me, more than one occasion, about preaching or other conversations that we've had. She's like, babe, it's not what you said, it's how you said it that was the issue. That little anecdote is helpful in this. A.W. Tozer, I really enjoyed this phrase. I've grabbed onto it. He says, it's not what a man does that determines whether his work is sacred or secular. It is why he does it. I'll say it again to make sure it's clear. It is not what a man does that determines whether his work is sacred or secular. It is why he does it. It breathes life into all that he does, whether it's to preach a sermon or whether it's to take out the trash. Any of these things, the thing itself can be completely secular if not done trusting and loving and motivated by love for Jesus Christ. The same is true on the opposite side. It could be something as simple as scrubbing toilets or doing garden work for someone else, or just getting stones. I don't know what job you don't want to necessarily do. Any of those things that maybe we would think is menial labor, all of those things can be sacred work unto God because of what our motivation is, why we are doing it. In every role and responsibility you've been given, you have an eternal perspective, and you have an ultimate goal that must drive the way that we steward these roles. And I think that's an important word for us to use, or responsibility. All of these different roles and responsibilities are God-given things. Even if we take them on in some ways, we can also choose to put some of them off. But many of these things we need to remember that we will give an answer for how we are acting in these things and what we're doing with them. And not necessarily to the same standard that our bosses would consider it. This is what makes our work so different. A Christian worker may not be able to hit every single metric that their boss wants them to, and still in the kingdom of God be great.
Yeah.
Because they have done so because they love Jesus Christ, and they have done it unto him. And they have loved him, and motivated by Jesus Christ and his grace. And so we must together actually go forward and think through all of those different roles and responsibilities, and do it unto the Lord. I think probably the most helpful, I'm gonna turn here, Colossians 3, 18 through 4:6 is really where I think it's most helpful for us. So feel free to either listen along, or if you want to open up to Colossians 3, it's the end of Colossians 3, verse 18, all the way down through 4:6. I'm going to read all of that. You're going to see at the very heart of it is those famous verses, verse 23 and 24, but we'll get to that in a minute. Colossians 3:18. Wives, submit to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be harsh with them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord, and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. The passage talks, if you see this, it talks about many different roles or responsibilities of these individuals, each having a different one. You're most likely, you're not going to juggle all these at one time, and some of it's impossible to do. Others that you just won't have the opportunity to do. So, you have wives, husbands, children, parents, workers who are under others, bondservants, workers or masters who are over others, these masters and lords. And I think even by this, it's not just these few categories that Paul's talking about, but rather in any situation that you are at, this is going to apply. Again, each one's have a little bit different thing that they ought to do. However, at the center of this, it's fair to assume that Paul is handling a larger topic, and at the heart of it is verses 23 and 24. And this is where I think it's helpful for us to zone in. I'll say it again. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. So in response to the question, how should a Christian properly approach their roles and responsibilities in our different stations of life, I would say three things from this text, and I'd like for you to kind of respond too, in how we would respond, not only from Colossians, but then broader, some of the things that we've talked about. One is just live and work heartily. And all he means by that is with all of yourself, like that your whole being is willing to give itself into that work. But it doesn't stop there. Unto the Lord. The direction here is not unto men, and he makes that pretty clear. He says, you are serving the Lord Christ. So when you and I take out the trash, or when we change a dirty diaper for our wives, or whatever the thing is, we are not only serving them, we certainly are, but we are more importantly as Christians serving Christ. And this breathes so much meaning into every different part of our lives, both the things that we would call work and those things that seem like just living, that we would do it unto the Lord. So I'd say work and live heartily. I would say work and live heartily unto the Lord. And then lastly, and this is a much broader topic, but he touches off on it at the end of this passage in verse 6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. The reason Paul can say this idea of being gracious, is because he knows, and he speaks to this throughout the whole text, both in our conversion, our sanctification, our glorification, in all of life, the grace that we have received as believers. And so it ought to be a response for us in how we treat others as a gracious response. Yes, in our speech, but also in the way that we encourage, interact with, the way that we respond when people make mistakes, that we would also be gracious people. I'll say a couple more things about that. The only way that you and I can do this work unto the Lord heartily is by his grace. We saw this when we started talking about in him we have redemption, in Ephesians 1, talking about that it is a gracious act of God to give us these things and to do this work for us. It's all centered on the gospel in Jesus Christ. And therefore, for us to move forward in doing anywhere from what the world may say is an important task to menial tasks, all of these things are truly empowered by the grace of God. Otherwise, we cannot do them. We will do them poorly. We will do them with wrong motivations, and we may, in the sense, do them in sin. And so I think for us to do it by grace is really important for us to remember. There are two responses that many of us tend to do, and I want to talk about both of them. When we fail, we must respond in grace. No, what I mean by that is our need for grace. This is what I need. I need God's grace as the foundation to answer my failure. That when I get destroyed and and dejected and worried, remember that God is gracious to give and to bless and to lift us up again. On the other hand, when we do well, when there's success, remember that you have always needed God's grace. And the foundation of your success is God's grace. So when something turns out well, or someone's pleased with your service to them, or your boss, or your wife, or husband, or kids, or things go well, remember that it is all of God's grace, and not to turn it for an occasion for us to boast. Because again, Paul over and over is pointing us to the grace, to the God of grace, to the praise of his glorious grace when he first talks about election. But all these things reminding us that it is a gift to us, and his continual gift to us to be able to fulfill these things. So in response to the three things that I was working on: work heartily as unto the Lord, by God's grace.
Yeah, that's good.
I know we've talked about it. Any other thoughts here?
No, I mean, I think that idea of the grace of God is so key, because the beauty of talking about this from a Christian perspective is that we can sit down and we can do what you suggested at the beginning. We can look at our stations in life to figure out what they are, make sure we're considering all of them, and then we can evaluate them honestly. And we're doing all of that not so that we can figure out how to please God, so that we can do this in a way to make him happy with us. But it's couched in the finished work of Christ. The cross and the resurrection are undergirding all of that exhortation. And so we understand that we do these things as worship to him. It brings him glory, it brings him honor, it brings him delight, I think, in the right way to understand that too. Yeah. But to know that our very thinking about it and doing it heartily to the Lord is something that he delights in too. Yeah. And he delights in giving us our stations in life. He delights in giving us the seasons that we have in those stations in life. I think, as we do pastoral counseling and as we just talk with people along the way, as we reflect on our own past and sometimes present circumstances too, we know how easy it is to anywhere from be dissatisfied with or just struggle with, like, what am I supposed to do with this station of life? What am I supposed to do with this season of it? And wrestle with, again, like our heart idolatries can come up so easily. And so I don't know, like maybe for some of you watching this, you're thinking those things or feeling or experiencing those things just in light of the coronavirus situation. Maybe because some of those busy things have been taken off and the stations in life bubble to the surface again. We see how maybe some of those aren't being focused on the way they need to be. Maybe we're finding ourselves in positions with neighbors or spouses or with our kids or extended family where there's some tensions or animosity or enmity because we have not been stewarding those things well. Or we've been trying to steward them in our own power, and we are frustrated because no matter how hard we try to do something in our own power, it's falling short, and the person we're trying to please or steward or whatever, it just doesn't seem like it's working.
Yeah.
And in those moments, it maybe drives us back to what we were talking about last week with lament and stuff. Like, God, where are you? Did you give me these things to care about? Or I think you did, but I don't know what to do. And it can seem like God is distant, or that we have to do something to change our circumstances so that he can be happy with us and work with us again. Yeah. But it's a beautiful thing to know that in the midst of those circumstances, God is walking with us, and he is calling us to work with him in a sense of just like he's calling us to these things, and he's empowering us to these things. But as we were talking about this in a class we did this week, the old Jewish proverb that says God didn't make bread trees, like he made things so that you would take them and work with them. So in that sense, like God is walking with us, but he's calling us to work with him to steward these things. That's what stewardship's all about. Yeah. Take these things, and as an image bearer, and now for us as redeemed image bearers, work it out. But in the midst of all that, to know that where we're feeling like things aren't the way they should be, or they're not the way we want them to be, that it is not an accident, and that it's not outside of God's sovereignty, and it's not outside of his sovereign love, that he's given us those seasons. And so there's wisdom to work, right? To work heartily to steward them well. Yeah. But in the midst of that, we must do it for the Lord, and understanding that our identity is in him. Galatians 2:20, just that idea of us, our union with Christ means that we're dead. Our natural person is dead, and we're to live in Christ. And so just that idea of our death, and now it's Christ that lives in me, and now by faith, I walk that out. Yeah. So those things I think are helpful. So just an encouragement to, in the midst of assessing and in the midst of working through the ups and downs of those, to trust in God, to trust in his love and faithfulness to us, and to be proactive at identifying that natural man that's, again, wants to bubble up with things. Yes. It's so easy.
In either way, right? Like in the way where we get so discouraged, and we're like, I'm worthless.
Yeah, right. In the despair.
And which is when we grind away at despair, that's sin. If we continue to stay in that, it's sin. Look to Christ.
It's that idea of like we're stuck in a cul-de-sac just spinning. Yeah. We're just spinning in loathing and self-pity. No, look to Christ.
Yeah, that's right.
Pull out of that cul-de-sac. Take your time to talk with God in there. Yeah. And work that out.
The despair is not wrong. It's when we stay and we do not trust Christ. We do not look to him. Yeah. And it may take a long time to get out of that cul-de-sac in a sense. But we must, sorry to make the analogy go further, but my point is that a Christian call is to continue to look out to Christ and to call on him and to ask. So today's encouragement certainly is like there's some exhortation here, like, hey, consider these things. Don't work worthlessly or live like just like nothing matters. No, live and work heartily unto the Lord by his grace. But remember, there is grace in all of this, both for he who succeeds in all of his life. Remember, it's God's gracious gift, but then also he who struggles. I think that's the majority of us, to use his time so wisely. When we look back Like, what did you do during this time? We don't really want to answer that question a lot of times. There's grace here for us. It's a good reminder for us to look to him and consider these things and allow him to shape us during this time.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. And I would say too, like, take the time to meditate on even just one station in life. I mean, you take just the role of being a husband, you know. I think of it's similar. Paul says it similarly in Ephesians as he does Colossians, but the call for husbands to love their wives, like to steward that role, is to love my wife. He says to do so in the same way that Christ has loved me or has loved the church, not to be harsh. I mean, all these things, it's just like, oh my goodness. I mean, if I say this to anybody else, do as I say, not as I do, because I realized how much I fall short in actually stewarding that role well. Yeah. So even as we think of all of those things that we've mentioned, take some time, I would say, like, take some time to pray for each one. God, help me to steward these things well. Help me to see my idols in the midst of those stewardships. But take some time to meditate on each one and what Scripture does have to say about it. Considering what Chris said, the idea of giving yourself to each one of those, to do it heartily, but do it for the Lord and not to men, and do it couched in the grace of God, in the resurrection, the crucifixion and resurrection and reign of Jesus.
And we just because we're all live here and everything's going, just to remind you, the reason we're talking about this is because if I had to show you my whole list of responsibilities and roles that I wish I was fulfilling better, I'd be really embarrassed because they're not fulfilled well. So praise God for his grace and his love and care in Jesus Christ, that he both covers that and enables us to obey. It's a good grace that he gives to us. And so in the end, we worship our great God.
Amen. So. Good. Well, I'm also looking forward to Sunday. I believe on Sunday we'll be talking more about the idea of inheritance. Join us, so to speak, at around 9 a.m. The weekly video will be available, and we will be in verses 11 and 12.
Yeah.
Is that right? Verses 11 and 12 of Ephesians 1, as we normally post our Sunday times. So I don't even know what to call them, but that's what they are. But yeah, we continue to pray that those are edifying and helpful, but we continue to pray for us to be gathered again. Even 25 sounds like a big number right now, a group of 25, right? So somebody was telling me last night, they were like, we've done 2 services, why not 14, right? So so yeah, we can just spin them out.
Hey.
Services of 25 all day long on Sunday. We'll bring it back.
My voice will be completely gone.
That's right. I'm not singing 14 times. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants that. All right, good. Well, the announcements are no different than they were last week. Keep up to date on Realm, and continue to pray for one another. Let's steward that responsibility well, the privilege well of being brothers and sisters covenanted together as a local body. To continue to steward that well and ask for God's grace and empowerment to steward those things well, to love one another even when we can't do it in all the ways we normally do. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday evening. I don't know what topic we'll talk about next week yet.
Me neither.
We'll figure it out and let you know. But thanks for joining us tonight, and know that we're praying for you and we miss you.
We love you guys.
Yep. We'll see you next week.
See ya.